The Roman sun beats down on the sprawling, chaotic set of Cleopatra in 1962. But the heat radiating from the production is more than just atmospheric. It is the heat of chaos, of hemorrhaging money, and of a scandal so monumental it is shaking the foundations of Hollywood and rattling the halls of the Vatican. At the epicenter of this swirling hurricane is Elizabeth Taylor. At 30 years old, she is not merely a movie star, she is arguably the most famous woman in the world, a celestial body around which the entire industry revolves. She is the first actor in history to command a $1 million salary for a single film, a figure so astronomical it seems a fantasy. But the real story unfolding here at Cinecittà Studios is not about money. It is about a collision of two titanic forces, a love affair so powerful, so public, and so forbidden that it has eclipsed the ridiculously over-budget epic they are supposed to be filming. She is Cleopatra, the Queen of the Nile. He is Richard Burton, the brilliant, hard-drinking Welsh actor of stage and screen playing her Mark Antony. Both are married to other people. Taylor is the wife of Eddie Fisher, the crooner she famously stole from America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds, a scandal that had only recently branded her a home-wrecking Jezebel. Burton is married to the steadfast Sybil Williams. The script calls for them to fall in love, but as they film their first kiss, the director, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, yells, "Cut!" and then yells it again and again. But they do not stop. In that lingering, defiant embrace under the glare of the hot studio lights and the watchful eyes of a stunned crew, a line is crossed. The performance has become reality. Artifice has combusted into a raw, undeniable, and catastrophic passion. Le scandale, as the press dubs it, is born. The fallout is immediate and global. Paparazzi, a relatively new phenomenon, swarm the set, hiding in bushes, using long lenses to capture any stolen glance or secret touch. Their affair is not a whisper. It is a front-page headline screamed across the world from New York to London to Rome. The Vatican City's weekly paper publishes an open letter denouncing Taylor's erotic vagrancy. She is condemned by the U.S. Congress. She and Burton are two married people conducting an adulterous affair, and they are not hiding it. They are flaunting it, dining in Rome's finest restaurants, seemingly oblivious to the moral outrage they are igniting. It is a level of public defiance no star had ever dared before. This moment is the essence of Elizabeth Taylor. Breathtakingly beautiful, supremely talented, and utterly magnificently defiant of convention. It is the story of a woman who did not just live a life, but devoured it on her own terms, consequences be damned. To understand the woman at the center of this global firestorm, one must understand the child who was meticulously crafted from birth to become a queen, long before she ever set foot in ancient Egypt. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born not in the heart of Hollywood, but in Hampstead, London, on February 27, 1932. Her parents, Francis and Sarah, were wealthy American art dealers living abroad. From the moment of her birth, she was extraordinary. She was born with a genetic mutation, distichiasis, which gave her a perfect double row of eyelashes framing a pair of eyes that were not blue or green but a deep, startling, and almost violet hue. This unique beauty was both a genetic lottery ticket and the foundation of her life's path. A path charted with relentless determination by her mother. Sarah Southern Taylor had been a stage actress herself before her marriage, and she harbored ambitions that had been sublimated, not extinguished. In her preternaturally beautiful daughter, Sarah saw a second chance, a vessel for her own unrealized dreams. The idyllic London childhood was cut short by the looming shadow of World War II. In 1939, the family evacuated to the United States, settling in the sun-drenched glamour of Los Angeles. The proximity to the great movie studios was not a coincidence. Sarah, armed with her daughter's otherworldly beauty, immediately set about navigating the treacherous waters of Hollywood. She was the original momager, a woman of iron will and sophisticated grace who made sure her daughter was seen by the right people. After a brief unsuccessful contract with Universal Pictures, Sarah secured a screen test at the biggest, most powerful studio of them all, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the home of more stars than there are in heaven. MGM signed the 9-year-old Elizabeth to a long-term contract. She was now a part of the legendary studio system, a well-oiled machine that manufactured stars with industrial efficiency. Her early roles were small, but her presence was undeniable. She appeared in Lassie Come Home, 1943. But her true breakthrough, the film that transformed her from a pretty child actress into a bona fide star, was National Velvet, 1944. She played Velvet Brown, a determined young English girl who dreams of training her horse, the Pie, to win the Grand National Steeplechase. It was a role that required not just acting ability, but equestrian skill and immense physical courage. Taylor threw herself into it with a professionalism that was startling for a 12-year-old. The film was a massive Technicolor hit and a critical success. It made Elizabeth Taylor a household name. The world fell in love with the brave, beautiful girl with the violet eyes. The film's success cemented her place at MGM, but it also locked her into a specific kind of stardom. She was the studio's prized possession, a beautiful, perfect child living out perfect, wholesome fantasies on screen. The reality of her childhood was one of grueling work, long hours on set, and an education received from studio tutors between takes. She grew up not in a schoolyard, but on sound stages, her friendships dictated by her co-stars, her life governed by the studio's rigid schedule. She was a queen in training, but the castle was a gilded cage. The years following the triumph of National Velvet locked Elizabeth Taylor into the very heart of the MGM machine, but it was a heart of glittering, suffocating machinery. As she navigated adolescence, she was one of the most famous teenagers in the world, yet her life was a study in carefully managed artifice. The studio controlled everything. Her education was handled by on-set tutors. Her friendships were often with other child actors. Her public appearances were meticulously stage-managed, and most frustratingly, her career was dictated by the studio's desire to keep its prized asset in a box of wholesome, commercially safe Technicolor fantasies. She was churning out films like Cynthia, 1947, and A Date with Judy, 1948. Light, forgettable fare that required her to be little more than a beautiful, charming presence. She was a superstar, but she felt like a puppet. Her immense talent and burgeoning dramatic instincts stifled by scripts she found trivial and unchallenging. This profound frustration with her professional life bled into her personal life, fueling a desperate desire to escape the suffocating control of both the studio and her fiercely ambitious mother. She craved adulthood, not just in her roles, but in her life. And in the Hollywood of 1950, the ultimate performance of adulthood for a young woman was marriage. It was in this state of restless rebellion that she met Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the handsome, fast-living heir to the Hilton Hotel empire. To the 17-year-old Taylor, he represented everything she yearned for: sophistication, independence, and a world outside the carefully curated confines of MGM. Their courtship was a whirlwind, and their engagement was announced to a public hungry for a real-life fairy tale. The wedding in May 1950 was not an intimate family affair. It was a studio-produced blockbuster, a media event of staggering proportions. MGM, sensing a massive publicity opportunity, orchestrated the entire spectacle. 15,000 fans swarmed the streets outside the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. The studio gifted her a wedding gown designed by their legendary costume designer Helen Rose, the same designer who would create Grace Kelly's royal wedding dress years later. The guest list was a who's who of Hollywood royalty. It was the wedding of the year, a perfect fantasy of American glamour. But the fantasy shattered almost the instant it began. The fairy tale wedding was followed by a nightmarish 3-month honeymoon in Europe. The charming, sophisticated heir was revealed to be a volatile, abusive, and controlling man with a serious gambling and drinking problem. Away from the cameras and the watchful eyes of the studio, he was reportedly cruel and dismissive, both emotionally and physically. For Taylor, who had lived her entire life in a protective if stifling bubble, the experience was a brutal and terrifying shock. The escape she had so desperately sought had turned into another, far more dangerous prison. The disillusionment was swift and total. Just 9 months after the wedding of the century, a heartbroken and publicly humiliated Elizabeth Taylor filed for divorce. Her first desperate grasp at adult freedom had ended in catastrophic failure. Returning to MGM with her head held high, the divorce only intensified her desire to be taken seriously as an artist. She was no longer a naive girl. She was a 19-year-old woman who had experienced profound heartbreak, and she was determined to channel that newfound emotional depth into her work. She began to fight, to lobby, to push back against the frothy, meaningless roles the studio offered her. Her moment came when the visionary director George Stevens was casting his next project, a dark, psychologically complex adaptation of Theodore Dreiser's novel, An American Tragedy. The film was to be called A Place in the Sun. Taylor was desperate for the role of Angela Vickers, a beautiful, wealthy socialite who becomes the tragic object of a poor young man's obsessive ambition. Stevens was deeply skeptical. He saw her as just a pretty face, a product of the MGM glamour machine, incapable of the deep, nuanced emotion the role required. But Taylor persisted, and she had a powerful ally in the film's male lead, Montgomery Clift. Clift, a brilliant and notoriously intense method actor, was one of the few who saw past her beauty to the raw talent underneath. He recognized a fellow artist, a kindred spirit, and he championed her for the role. Their connection on set was immediate and profound. It was not a romance. It was a deep, platonic love affair of two souls who understood each other implicitly. Monty, as she called him, became her best friend, her mentor, and the first person in her professional life to treat her as a serious peer. He taught her how to access her own emotional truth, how to be vulnerable and real on camera, and how to strip away the artifice she had been taught her entire life. Under Stevens' demanding direction and with Clift's unwavering support, Taylor delivered a performance that stunned the world. Her portrayal of Angela was a revelation. It was a performance of breathtaking subtlety, vulnerability, and tragic depth. In the film's famous claustrophobic close-ups, her face becomes a canvas of conflicting emotions: love, fear, desire, and a heartbreaking innocence on the verge of destruction. When A Place in the Sun was released in 1951, the critical reception was ecstatic. The world finally saw what Monty Clift had seen all along. The pretty girl with the violet eyes was a great actress. The film was a triumph, earning 9 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director for Stevens. For Taylor, it was more than just a hit movie, it was a vindication. It was the moment she shed the skin of the child star and was reborn as a formidable dramatic artist. She had proven her worth to the world, and more importantly to herself. She now had the power and the artistic credibility to demand better roles, to shape her own career. She had escaped the gilded cage professionally. Now she would turn her attention to rebuilding her personal life, seeking the stability and safety she had never known, a search that would lead her into the arms of a man 20 years her senior, and into the next, even more dramatic chapter of her epic story. Having proven her formidable talent in A Place in the Sun, Elizabeth Taylor entered the 1950s as a new kind of entity in Hollywood. She was no longer just MGM's beautiful property. She was a critically acclaimed actress with newfound leverage. However, her personal life remained in a state of post-divorce turmoil, craving the stability and safety that her own chaotic childhood and disastrous first marriage had denied her. Her gaze fell upon Michael Wilding, a refined, distinguished British stage actor 20 years her senior. To Taylor, Wilding represented everything Nicky Hilton was not. He was calm, paternal, intellectual, and safe. Their marriage in 1952 was not a passionate whirlwind affair, but a deliberate choice, a search for a peaceful harbor in the stormy sea of her life. For a time, it seemed to work. They had 2 sons, Michael Jr. and Christopher, and settled into a life of domestic tranquility, a stark contrast to the high-octane drama of her public persona. Professionally, she was at the absolute peak of her powers and popularity. She starred in a string of successful films, including Ivanhoe, 1952, and Elephant Walk, 1954. But the most significant film of this era was George Stevens' sprawling Texas epic, Giant, 1956. The production was a massive undertaking, placing her alongside 2 of the most iconic male stars of the generation, Rock Hudson and James Dean. On the dusty plains of Marfa, Texas, she formed a deep and abiding friendship with Hudson. In a repressed Hollywood era, Taylor's intuitive acceptance and fierce loyalty made her a safe confidant for the closeted actor. Their bond would become one of the most important and enduring of her life, a relationship that would later have profound, world-changing consequences. The production was also marked by tragedy. Her charismatic and rebellious co-star, James Dean, was killed in a car crash shortly after filming Wrapped, another premature loss that seemed to haunt her orbit. Her marriage to the gentle Michael Wilding, however, could not contain her restless spirit. The safety she had craved began to feel like boredom. She was a woman of immense passion, and she had settled for a life of quiet companionship. The harbor had become too placid. The world was about to send her a tidal wave, a man whose personality was as big, as brash, and as spectacular as her own. His name was Mike Todd. Mike Todd was not a Hollywood insider. He was a force of nature, a larger-than-life showman, a cigar-chomping, fast-talking producer who had made his name on Broadway with extravagant productions and had recently conquered Hollywood by producing the Oscar-winning epic Around the World in 80 Days. He was brash, vulgar, brilliant, and utterly captivated by Elizabeth Taylor. He pursued her with the same relentless, spectacular energy he put into his productions. He showered her with attention, with laughter, and with diamonds, including a 29-carat diamond ring that was so large she referred to it as her ice skating rink. He was a tornado of charisma, and he swept her off her feet. He was not just a suitor, he was an event. She divorced Wilding, and in 1957 she married Mike Todd. For Elizabeth, her marriage to Todd was a period of profound, delirious happiness. She had finally met her match. He was not intimidated by her fame. He reveled in it. He was a man who could dominate any room, even one that contained Elizabeth Taylor. Their life together was a whirlwind of private planes, lavish parties, and passionate, often explosive arguments. He celebrated her, challenged her, and loved her with a ferocity she had never known. She gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth Liza Todd, in August 1957. At 25, she was a wife, a mother of 3, and the biggest movie star in the world, starring in critically acclaimed hits like Raintree County, which earned her her first Oscar nomination, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. For the first time in her life, it seemed that the private woman and the public icon were in a state of perfect, happy alignment. She had found her great love. This delirious happiness made the tragedy that followed all the more devastating. On the night of March 22, 1958, Mike Todd was scheduled to fly from Burbank, California to New York on his private plane, aptly named the Lucky Liz. He was headed to a dinner in his honor at the Friars Club. Elizabeth, who was suffering from a severe cold and a fever of 102 degrees, had planned to go with him, but reluctantly stayed behind at his insistence. In the early hours of the morning, the plane, overloaded and flying in icy conditions, crashed in the mountains of New Mexico. There were no survivors. The news was delivered to her by her friend and business manager, Kurt Frings. Her reaction was not one of quiet tears. It was a primal, animalistic scream of pure, unadulterated agony that reportedly echoed through her home. At the funeral, her grief was so profound and so raw that she had to be sedated. The press photos from that day show a woman utterly shattered, her face a mask of incomprehensible pain, hidden behind a black veil. At the age of 26, Elizabeth Taylor, the world's greatest movie star, was a widow. The great, spectacular love of her life had been extinguished in a fiery wreck. The world mourned with her, watching the tragedy of their queen play out on a global stage. She had reached the pinnacle of fame and found perfect happiness, only to have it snatched away in the most brutal manner imaginable. This devastating loss would become the catalyst for the next and most scandalous chapter of her life, a chapter that would see the public's sympathy turn to vicious condemnation as she sought comfort in the arms of her late husband's best friend. In the desolate abyss of grief that followed Mike Todd's death, Elizabeth Taylor was a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of public sympathy and private agony. The world mourned the tragic young widow, but behind the closed doors of her Beverly Hills home, she was simply shattered. It was into this vacuum of despair that Eddie Fisher stepped. Fisher, a popular singer with a clean-cut image, was not just a friend. He was Mike Todd's best friend, his protege. His wife, the actress Debbie Reynolds, was America's absolute sweetheart, a bubbly girl-next-door icon. Together, the Fishers and the Todds had been Hollywood's golden foursome. It was only natural that Eddie united with Elizabeth in their shared, profound love for the man they had both lost, would spend his days and nights consoling the grieving widow. At first, the public saw this as a noble, compassionate gesture. But soon the dynamic began to shift. The shared grief, a powerful and intoxicating bond, morphed into something else. They clung to each other, two people trying to hold on to the ghost of a man by holding on to each other. The press, ever watchful, began to notice the photos of them together. Their expressions of shared sorrow, now tinged with something more intimate, began to fill the gossip columns. The narrative of the tragic widow began to curdle into the story of a predatory seductress, and Debbie Reynolds, at home with her two young children, including a baby Carrie Fisher, was cast as the ultimate victim, the innocent wife betrayed by both her husband and her best friend. The public turning was not just swift, it was volcanic. Elizabeth Taylor, the object of global pity, became the object of global condemnation almost overnight. She was branded a home wrecker, a Jezebel, a vamp who had preyed on a grieving man. The letters that poured into the studios were filled with hate. She was heckled in public. The moral outrage was immense. In the court of public opinion, she was guilty of the ultimate sin, destroying the marriage of America's sweetheart. Faced with this universal condemnation, a lesser star would have retreated, issued an apology, or hidden from view. Elizabeth Taylor did the opposite. In a move of breathtaking defiance that would come to define her entire life, she doubled down. She refused to be shamed for finding comfort in a world that had been ripped apart. In 1959, she converted to Judaism, Fisher's faith, and shortly after his divorce from Reynolds was finalized, she married Eddie Fisher. It was an act of stunning audacity, a declaration to the world that she would live her life on her own terms, regardless of their judgment. The marriage, however, was born of grief and trauma, and it was doomed from the start. She had not found a new great love. She had found a temporary placeholder for the one she had lost. The world now saw her not as a great actress, but as a great sinner, a woman whose appetites were as scandalous as her beauty. It was in this atmosphere of public hostility that she entered one of the most dramatic and life-threatening periods of her life. To fulfill her contractual obligations to MGM before she could move on to her record-breaking deal for Cleopatra, she was forced to star in a film she openly detested, Butterfield 8, 1960. She played Gloria Wandress, a high-class call girl, a role she felt was a thinly veiled commentary on her own public image as a woman of loose morals. While filming in London, her health, always fragile, collapsed completely. She was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of pneumonia. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. She was rushed to a London hospital, her temperature soaring, her lungs filling with fluid. The world's media, which had just been vilifying her, now held a morbid death watch outside the hospital doors. Her condition worsened. She stopped breathing. Doctors worked frantically, but her vital signs faded. For several minutes, she was clinically dead. In a last-ditch effort to save her life, surgeons performed an emergency tracheotomy, cutting a hole in her throat to create an airway. The procedure was a success. She was brought back from the brink of death. The news of her miraculous survival caused another violent swing in the public's perception. The homewrecker was forgotten. In her place was the courageous survivor, the fragile beauty who had cheated death. The global condemnation was replaced by a wave of prayer and relief. The tracheotomy scar on her neck became a visible, powerful symbol of her resilience. It was in this whirlwind of scandal, sickness, and survival that the Academy Awards season began. Taylor received her 4th Oscar nomination for her performance in the very film she loathed, Butterfield 8. On the night of the 33rd Academy Awards in April 1961, Elizabeth Taylor was the sentimental favorite. When her name was announced as the winner for Best Actress, the ovation was thunderous. Looking breathtakingly beautiful but painfully frail, she walked to the stage, the fresh scar on her throat visible to the entire world. Her speech was short and breathless. The win was widely seen, even by Taylor herself, as a sympathy Oscar, a reward not for her performance but for her survival. She would later quip, "I won it for my tracheotomy." It was a cynical yet likely accurate assessment of how the Hollywood machine operated. In the span of 2 years, she had been a widow, a homewrecker, a near-death patient, and now an Oscar-winning queen. She had survived a trial by fire that would have incinerated any other star. She was now at the absolute peak of her fame, power, and notoriety. She was unbreakable, and she was about to sail to Rome to portray the most powerful woman in history, a role that would lead her to the great love and the greatest scandal of her life. Elizabeth Taylor arrived in Rome in 1961 to film Cleopatra not merely as an Oscar-winning actress, but as a force of nature who had already survived scandal, divorce, public condemnation, and death itself. She was at the zenith of her power and fame. The film was destined to be the most expensive and epic production in history, a chaotic, sprawling behemoth of a movie that was already plagued by production delays and a ballooning budget. The studio, 20th Century Fox, was betting its entire existence on the film's success and on the magnetic power of its queen. They needed a Mark Antony who could stand opposite her, an actor with the gravitas, talent, and sheer masculine force to be a believable partner for Elizabeth Taylor. They found him in Richard Burton. Burton was her opposite in every way except for the ways that mattered most. He was the son of a Welsh coal miner, a man of the stage steeped in Shakespeare and poetry. She was a product of the Hollywood studio system. He was a celebrated intellectual actor. She was a global movie star. But beneath the surface, they were mirror images, both possessed of a blazing talent, a deep-seated insecurity, a ferocious appetite for life. and a dangerous love for alcohol. When they met on the set, the collision was inevitable and atomic. This was not the gentle companionship of Michael Wilding or the grief-stricken bond with Eddie Fisher. This was lightning striking a powder keg. Their affair, which began under the hot Italian sun, became known simply as Le Scandal. It was a global obsession. They were the two most famous, most beautiful, and most unapologetically adulterous people in the world. The newly minted paparazzi hunted them relentlessly, their every secret dinner and stolen kiss becoming front-page news. The Vatican condemned their erotic vagrancy. Their respective spouses were left in a wake of public humiliation, but Taylor and Burton, caught in the eye of their own hurricane, seemed to thrive on the chaos. They were two magnificent beasts who had finally found each other, and they refused to let go no matter the cost. Their chemistry, so scandalous off-screen, translated into a powerful, palpable energy on-screen, providing the only authentic element in the bloated, troubled production of Cleopatra. When the film was finally released in 1963, it was a financial disaster for the studio, but a personal triumph for its stars. They were now free to marry, which they did in 1964. Thus began the Burton-Taylor years, a decade-long spectacle of passion, luxury, and public brawling. They were the most famous couple in the world, their lives a public performance of epic love. He showered her with jewels that became legendary: the 69-carat Taylor-Burton diamond, the 33-carat Krupp diamond, the 16th-century La Peregrina pearl. They traveled the world on yachts, drank champagne for breakfast, and fought with a ferocity that was as legendary as their lovemaking. They made 11 films together, many of them forgettable, but one of them was a masterpiece. In 1966, they took on the roles they were seemingly born to play. The toxic, alcohol-sodden, middle-aged academic couple George and Martha in the film adaptation of Edward Albee's searing play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? It was a shocking, audacious choice. Taylor, then only 34, allowed herself to be transformed. She gained weight, wore a graying wig, and stripped away every last vestige of her glamour to embody the bitter, braying, and heartbreaking Martha. The film was a brutal, self-lacerating 2-hour argument, and their performances were terrifyingly real, blurring the line between acting and reality. It was a tour de force for them both. For her raw, fearless, and vanity-free performance, Elizabeth Taylor won her second Academy Award for Best Actress. This time there was no talk of a pity Oscar. This was a reward for one of the greatest and most courageous performances in cinema history. Their tumultuous love story, however, could not sustain its own intensity. The drinking, the fighting, and the immense pressure of their shared fame eventually tore them apart. They divorced in 1974, remarried in a fit of passion in 1975, and divorced again for good just 10 months later. The great love affair was over. The years following her final split from Burton marked a new, quieter phase in Elizabeth's life. Her film career began to wane as Hollywood entered a new era. She continued to act, but the roles were less significant. She battled health problems, weight gain, and addictions to alcohol and prescription pills, famously checking herself into the Betty Ford Center. To the public, it seemed her third act would be one of quiet, semi-retired nostalgia. They were wrong. A different kind of tragedy would soon ignite the final and perhaps most meaningful chapter of her life. In 1985, her dear friend and giant co-star Rock Hudson died from complications of AIDS. His death was a profound shock to the world and a deeply personal blow to Taylor. In the mid-1980s, AIDS was a terrifying and deeply misunderstood plague, shrouded in fear, ignorance, and homophobic prejudice. It was the gay disease, and many in Hollywood and Washington were silent, afraid to associate themselves with the stigma. Elizabeth Taylor, who had spent her life defying convention and defending her friends with a fierce loyalty, was enraged by the silence and the injustice. The woman who had been a global superstar for 4 decades decided to use her immense fame as a weapon. In a move of extraordinary courage, she became one of the first and most vocal celebrity advocates in the fight against HIV/AIDS. She helped establish the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, in 1985 and later founded her own Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. She was relentless. She organized fundraising galas, lobbied a reluctant Reagan administration, and traveled the world to raise awareness and comfort patients. She famously stood before the U.S. Congress, not as a movie star, but as a citizen, and shamed them into action. "We're not here to talk about celebrity," she said, her voice filled with passion. "We're here to talk about life and death." In this third act, she found a new purpose, a cause that was bigger than any movie, any diamond, or any scandal. She transformed herself from an icon of glamour into an icon of compassion. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, at the age of 79, leaving behind a legacy that is almost too vast to comprehend. She was the last great star of the old Hollywood studio system, a link to a bygone era of glamour and power. She was a 2-time Academy Award-winning actress of breathtaking talent and range. She was a serial bride, a lover of magnificent jewels, and the survivor of countless scandals and near-death experiences. But her final and perhaps greatest legacy was that of a humanitarian. The woman who had once been condemned by the Vatican became a global symbol of courage and compassion, raising hundreds of millions of dollars and changing the global conversation about one of the worst health crises of the 20th century. Her life was a testament to the power of resilience. She lived without apology, loved without fear, and faced every triumph and every tragedy with a ferocious will to survive. She was a beautiful, flawed, magnificent, and utterly unique creation. A woman who was not just a star, but a force of nature who bent the world to her will. She was and forever will be a true and immortal legend,